Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we will be reviewing the Palma EL Tucan bio-innovative processed Colombia from April Coffee Roasters. And there's the box right there. And April, based out of Copenhagen, Denmark. And they're a coffee roaster that has appeared on this channel multiple times before. And when one of our subscribers, Benjamin, offered to go half and half on this coffee, I definitely took that opportunity, as it's been a number of years since we've last reviewed one of their coffees, and we've never reviewed one of their higher end offerings. So this felt like the perfect opportunity to do so, as this right here is day 42. And recipe we went with for this coffee was April's recipe for their brewer, which is a 15:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 95 degrees Celsius, about 203 degrees Fahrenheit. And my preferred brew method for this coffee was also their brewer, which does indicate a more medium fine grind. Now, roast profile for this coffee, April definitely does roast on the lighter side of things, and even though I typically say that it's a little tricky to tell when it comes to these more experimental processed coffees, you can definitely tell based off the brightness of this one is still very light in terms of the profile, so I'll go with a very light coffee in terms of that roast profile. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 22, first impression, and the cup did have a strong fermenty aspect in the aroma, but there was a little bit more clarity within the cup itself, as it was quite red fruit forward at the onset with a slight bit of the fermentiness and what I would describe as this wine-like acidity. Not overbearing though, which was the biggest takeaway I had from that first impression, as there was this candied red berry aspect with a notably heavy body. So it definitely left an interesting first impression, and I was kind of concerned that this coffee might get a little heavy and overbearing, but that first impression didn't necessarily lend itself towards that. We'll see what's going to happen from that point going forward, as on day 24, I ran into the V60 and immediately I decided I wasn't going to return to this brew method, as it seemed to lack the same clarity that I'd experienced from that first cup, as there was so much more of the boozy-like aspect to it, most distinctly that winey acidity I'd mentioned from that first impression. It wasn't particularly complex either, as it felt a little one-dimensional, skewing very heavy on the fermenty red berry side of things. Day 27 ran it through the Chemex and also opted against this brew method, as well as it was very heavy through the Chemex as well, with a lot of the raspberry and wine-like aspects present yet again in this coffee. It was definitely overbearing in that sense. Again, not a ton of depth behind what was a very heavy forward cup of coffee in general. So those 2 days I felt like were a little bit of throwaway days. We continue on to day 31 and back through the April dripper, and it is much better yet again, as this felt a lot more tame than the V60 or the Chemex, as there's still the slightly fermenty aspect in the aroma, but it's not nearly as strong in the cup itself, as there were tones underneath that were reminiscent of a lot of the stronger red fruit components to it, but they were a little bit more tempered in general, so not quite as strong and as vibrant, but even then, it was still just an okay cup of coffee, not necessarily something that I typically do enjoy. Day 34, the coffee continues to remain extremely vibrant through the April brewer, as it does tone down a lot of the fermenty aspects with a little bit more of a focus on the red aspects and even a fair bit of the stronger herbal aspect to it. So that's the biggest takeaway I had from the April dripper, was it was toning down some of my least favorite attributes, and it was giving the coffee a lot more depth and complexity in general, as what I would say was most present in this day was this kind of hibiscus-like aspect. That's typically what I describe as this very red forward component with this strong herbality to it. Raspberry immediately came to mind, as well, as it's a very intense and bright cup of coffee still, even with a lot of it being toned down. Day 36 continued with a reduction of temperatures. I actually lowered them even further, and at this moment I would say that it was somewhat reminiscent of sangria. That's the first thing that came to mind, as there was this strong red tropical nectar-like component to the cup, with an almost earthy yet fermenty sense to it as well. A little change, but rather I've seen an increase in the overall vibrancy to the cup, which is the thing I was trying to avoid the most. But this is one of those coffees where it gets to a certain stage and the coffee is just going to continue to increase with the intensity of it. So not a lot I can do on this day 36 mark. We continue on to day 39, and little has changed, as there's even a slight kind of olive-like quality to the cup. And that's something I experience with these very heavy coffees, is this kind of olive-like component to it. That's what it reminds me of anyway. But in addition to that, the heaviness continues to grow even with the adjustments, as there is a strong red fruit aspect and a strong earthy undertone to the cup. So not necessarily a lot of things that I do enjoy from coffee in general. So that's what I experienced up to that point. Much hasn't changed here on day 42 either. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting log so you can see what we're getting. And this might be a record. I think we have 5 level 5s. So let's go through those real quick, and we will start with the finish level 5. Yes, this is one of those coffees where I say it reaches that level 5 when it can be overbearing and too much, and that's the case with this one, as it does have one of those very long-lasting finishes where I am going to be tasting that sip I just had for a very long time after I finished it. So yes, very intense, very strong, and it's very sweet as well, so it is in that overbearing sweet aspect to it as well. And that's very much in the red fruit side of things, as the raspberry-like aspect to me was the most dominant factor. It is interesting the notes that they have on here. I think it's something along the lines of strawberry, peach, and then milky oolong. And that was one of the reasons I was very curious about this coffee, but I can say that I probably never experienced too much of the peachy-like aspects to it. And the oolong, if it's anything, it's that kind of interesting earthy herbality that I'm experiencing from the coffee. Nonetheless, the sweetness is very much skewed within that very strong red berry sense to it. Acidity, level 5. Yes, I've been mentioning right from the start that there's this warning-like acidity to the coffee, and that didn't change for the entirety of the time I was drinking it. Even then, I was trying to tone it down. Through the Chemex and through the V60, it was even stronger than this very high mark that I have for this coffee. So that should really explain just how strong and heavy this one was from start to finish. I don't necessarily enjoy that aspect in coffee. I don't think I've ever enjoyed a coffee that has reached that level 5 mark in terms of the acidity, but yeah, for me, it definitely reached that mark. As well as the florality. I kind of mentioned that red hibiscus-like aspect to the cup, and that was the other thing that I listed alongside that oolong component, because it was a little bit earthy, it was a little bit savory, and it had that red tone to it in general. So for me, the florality also reached that level 5, but there's very little in this coffee that wasn't overly intense. So that's why I reached that mark for me. As well as the berry fruit, level 5, this is one of those where it goes way beyond that level 5. One of those things we could say level 6. It's very intense, very strong, red, very red, berry forward from start to finish. I have no qualms about any of those being at level 5 because all of those things were very intense within this coffee. And we still have a bunch of level 4s. So we'll start with the citrus fruit, level 4. Yes, for me, there was also a very strong citric aspect to the coffee. Not something I mentioned too much that was announced, but I did say that there was this kind of tropical sangria-like aspect to it at one point. And that reminded me a slight bit of the citrus touch was present in it. Nothing I would say was overly defined, but at the same time, with the exception of maybe the red berry aspects, I wouldn't say that there was a lot within this coffee that was overly defined. So that right there did reach that level 4 as a much more generic citric component. Body level 4, I think that's the most surprising thing about this coffee. The other things I could have expected, especially after the first impression, but it had a lot more body than I think I was expecting, especially with the brewer. That being said, it is a much more concentrated recipe in general, so that could have played a role in it. However, it definitely had a lot more texture than I think I would have expected. Savoriness, level 4. Yes, and that was in line with that floral aspect that I had mentioned. Very much reminds me of that hibiscus-like component that I experienced from a lot of coffees, so that also justified that level 4 mark. And while there's still a fair bit of other things in this tasting wheel, I think I'll actually finish it on 2 things. This down for level 3. As mentioned, there's a peach component to it, and I think it might be the priming effect. I think after maybe a lot of a cool down, after kind of thinking about it, I might be able to experience a more subtle peach. But even then, given just how overbearing and dominant the other aspects are within this coffee, any of the other things I might have been able to experience are definitely just much more subtle relative to how strong the other things are within it. Cleanliness, level 2, I think that's maybe the last and by far the most important thing I must discuss within it. I said that nothing in this coffee was overly defined, but I think maybe it's one saving grace is I've had coffees that are somehow less clear and defined than this one, as this one was very heavy. It was very dominant and lasting, but even then I was able to pull at least a slight bit of clarity from it. So reaching that level 2 mark, I guess, is a nice little compliment, but I've always said minimum I'm looking for that level 4 mark in terms of the cleanliness. So level 2 is not going to be my favorite, as this coffee definitely did have a lot of the heavier aspects, fermentiness, booziness, no funkiness, but definitely there too in pretty significant abundance. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, it's 2023. Nothing has really changed in the sense that I don't really enjoy these coffees. I think a lot of people know that when it comes to the more heavy experimental processed Colombian coffees, the exception of the stuff that's come from Diego Bermudez, it hasn't been my favorite. And this one's very much in line with that. And it's for the exact same reasons that the other ones haven't been very heavy, overbearing red fruits in abundance. And that's what this coffee was. And I think I went into it expecting something a little different based off the notes that were on here. But at the end of the day, every time I have one of these more experimental, heavily experimental processed Colombian coffees, I tend to get a lot of similar results. And this one was no exception. So I don't hold it against April in any way because, as I always say, I don't enjoy these coffees from anybody. So it shouldn't be an exception that I don't enjoy this one either. I've had some not overly positive things to say about them from even some of my favorite coffee roasters in the entire world. So this one's just not my coffee. That's basically the best way to leave it. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, though, is anybody that does like these much more heavily processed coffees in general, as this one has great vibrancy. It's a very strong and intense coffee from start to finish. It's never going to be lacking for that intensity, especially in terms of those very dominant red fruit characteristics to it. Kind of the best direction I could point anyone towards for this one, and kind of the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're in the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the La Palma y Tucan bio-innovative processed Colombia from People Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.